This is Free to Exchange, the show where free markets and free-thinking scholars meet. I'm your host, Ben Powell. The future. That's the theme of today's show. First, we're going to discuss Social Security and how much does the federal government owe people who've paid into the system. What's the likelihood of these payments actually being made, and how will it affect our economic future? Then, on the second half of the show, we're going to discuss what my guest calls Tomorrow 3.0. How has technology enabled a new sharing economy? How will the sharing economy radically change how we live our lives, use our space, and own stuff? My first guest is Dr. Dennis Jansen. Dr. Jansen is a professor of economics and the Jordan Professor of Public Policy at Texas A&M University, where he also serves as the director of A&M's Private Enterprise Research Center. Dennis, despite the fact that you're from A&M, welcome to Texas Tech and welcome to the show.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
So let's start with what's the government's obligation under Social Security to make payments to workers now and in the future?
Sure. So Social Security is basically a promise from the government to pay future benefits in exchange for current taxes. So currently we have people working, they're paying taxes, and when they retire, they expect to receive those benefits. So it's a promise, it's a pay-as-you-go system. So the current workers are paying in taxes and they're being almost immediately distributed to current retirees. And in this system, current workers are expecting those future payments. And so the obligation of the government is to honor its promises.
So I know you're an economist, not a lawyer, but you said, they made a promise. Well, how credible is this promise? Is it a legally binding promise, or is it just a matter of public policy and the honor of future people in Congress to do what somebody said they would in the past?
All right, it's a great question, and the answer is that it's the second. It's based on the honor of the government. It's based on the promises they've made. It's based on the politics of the situation. Current retirees and people getting close to retirement are certainly very interested in these Social Security promises, and they're certainly not going to be happy if they're changed. On the other hand, there's been various court cases. Social Security is not considered a liability in the legal sense. You certainly can't trade it. You can't sell your benefits. You can't get them early. There's no formal legal obligation.
Okay, and I know it's a little bit complicated, but basically, because you have to estimate how long people are going to live, when they're going to retire. How big is the government's, under current policy, promise to future workers? Not just the people who are retired, but everybody who's paying in.
Right, it's quite large. And so I'd like to answer this in two steps. So first of all, current retirees. We owe current retirees, in a current value sense, if we had to pay them all off today, about $8 trillion. How big is $8 trillion? Our national debt in the hands of the public is $14 trillion or so. So $8 trillion is substantial.
It's more than 50% of current government debt.
That's correct. And if you look at people who are currently working, the concept that we use is called accrued benefits. And so you take every single worker and you say, how much have they paid in today? If I had to buy them out, what would I have to pay them? And the answer is about $20 trillion. So current workers have a big stake in this program. And of course,
that's in addition to that $8 trillion.
$8 trillion, that's correct, yes.
So if somebody were to say, we're going to reform Social Security and we're going to pay all of the current retirees what they're owed, that's $8 trillion. But then you've got this massive $20 trillion accrued to other people that you either...
Right. And some of those individuals are 55 years old and close to retirement, and they've been planning for retirement, and they damn well expect that they're going to get that money when they retire.
And presumably those who are 55 or 60, they're the ones with the biggest accrued
stake and the biggest
benefit.
That's right,
because the 30-year-old hasn't accrued that much.
They have hardly accrued anything. That's correct.
So saying that we're going to let younger workers pay taxes to help the current ones, but we'll let them opt out, that doesn't do a whole lot.
No, it doesn't.
To solve this.
It does not.
And for perspective, then, what did you say? It's $20 trillion for current workers? What's the size of our economy? 4 trillion?
No. So So to put this in perspective, GDP is about $19 trillion. So our debt is our bonded debt is 14 trillion. Actually, it gets a little worse because we owe $8 trillion.
I was thinking about the federal government budget. That's why I was.
Okay.
But it's a factor of 5 over the size of the current federal budget, or basically the dollar value of our entire economy for a year.
Yes, that's correct.
So now within this, we'll come back to the likelihood and feasibility of some of this, but I know you've been involved in participating in a debate of like whether we should consider Social Security wealth or not. Right. And it seems a little bit weird because, as you mentioned at the beginning, it's not say like if I add my wealth and I go add up my bank account, that's actually money that's saved.
That's right.
Social Security is money that's taken from you and paid to somebody else.
That's correct.
I wouldn't call it savings if I paid my employee. So should we consider this wealth? How would it be considered wealth?
So the way we consider it wealth is that it affects people's behavior in planning for their retirement and thinking about their situation in retirement the same way as private savings do. Right. So if you've saved money in your 401k or you've got a private pension, if you're one of the lucky ones that still has a defined benefit pension, you consider that as the flow of income you're going to receive in retirement. And when you're planning for your retirement savings and your expenditures, you're considering that flow of income. And Social Security is providing another flow of income. And people that are 55 or 60 years old, you're thinking of retirement, you're planning on having that amount of Social Security income coming to you. So it influences your behavior pretty much the same way as having money in a bank and you're considering the flow of income that'll give you in retirement. And that's why as an economist, I'd consider it wealth, even if the U.S. Supreme Court says, well, it's not a legal liability in the same sense as a bond.
It's not a legal liability, nor is it actually a pool of savings sitting there with assets.
Well, that's a different issue, right? But for an individual's perspective, someone's promised you that flow of income. In a sense, you don't care how they're financing it or where it's coming from. And the fact that they're taxing our children and our grandchildren to pay us that's a different issue.
Right, because their behavior is the same regardless.
Right.
Actually, let me play with that for just a second. So how true do you think that is as you go across age groups? So I bet you current 60-year-olds treat their accrued Social Security benefits pretty much like wealth. Do you think that's true for 30-year-olds? Or do they start believing they're not going to actually get it and acting accordingly?
Yes. So I would perhaps speculate a bit on this, but yes, I think that the younger you are, the less likely it is that you're thinking of this as a promise with a degree of certainty to it. And actually, the last time we had a major Social Security reform, which was in 1983, I believe, the Greenspan Commission, the changes that were made to Social Security were made over a very long run period. Right. So people that were retired were almost completely unaffected. People that were near retirement were not affected. The people that were affected most were people like you and me, whose retirement age crept upward from 65 to 67. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't sound like much, but 2 years out of your expected lifespan at 65 is a big percentage. And so that actually cut Social Security promises, but that took place for people who were 30 years old in 1983 or 25 years old. It did not affect 55-year-olds.
Right.
And again, that's a political decision, but that's what
precisely because this can continue to be politically determined.
Right.
Now, this does impact, when you count it as wealth, this relates to the debate that's raging about inequality now, and is inequality on the rise in the United States. People can talk about incomes before taxes and transfers. Right. And that gives you a very different picture than inequality after taxes and transfers, because higher income people pay more taxes and get fewer transfers.
Exactly.
If we count Social Security as wealth, and now instead of looking at income inequality, look at wealth inequality, what does that do to the picture?
Yes, it has a very similar effect. So I think if I looked at one of our measures of inequality is called the Gini coefficient. And without explaining it, I'll just say that the Gini coefficient for wealth in the U.S., private wealth, is about 0.7. And it's been growing over time, which indicates increased inequality. If you look just at Social Security wealth, the Gini coefficient is way lower. There's way more equality of Social Security wealth across income distributions. And I think the Gini coefficient's like 0.2.
So when you put the two together, the overall story
it falls very much. It falls, the Gini coefficient for Social Security plus private wealth falls to like 0.55, and that's a huge decline. I know it's just a number, but it's a huge decline, and it's hardly grown over time. I think it was.
That's different than the political narrative.
It's very different than the political narrative, and it's very different than what you see with private wealth.
Now, this, of course, assumes that these Social Security benefits would actually get paid.
Well, that's
what I want to push you on now. So you've mentioned 20 trillion or 8 trillion to existing retirees, 20 trillion in promises to workers,
Right.
about 14 trillion in debt held by the public of government bonds.
Right.
We can add on to this Medicare, which has a similar problem as Social Security.
It's the same kind of numbers that we owe. If you take current retirees plus accrued benefits to current workers, it's like $35 trillion for Medicare. It's the same. It's a little bit bigger, but the same order of magnitude as Social Security.
35, 28,
Yes.
14.
Yes.
As we're piling these together, these sound like numbers that can't be paid.
And there's another $8 trillion in accrued benefits to federal employees, and so people who have retired are going to retire from federal government service.
So looking out, I won't say 5 years or 10 years. I don't think anyone's Social Security check is disappearing tomorrow. How likely is it that this program can last in its current form with its current promises 15 years down the road, 20 years down the road, whatever time frame you want?
Yeah. So I think when I think about that, I sort of want to think about entire federal government obligations to pay out, to spend, and think of government tax revenues. And under current projections or current law, we are running huge deficits. I think our deficit's almost $1 trillion during peacetime and during a great expansion of the economy recently. So we're running huge deficits by historical standards in a time of peace. And frankly, these could continue for years, but they're unsustainable. They cannot continue forever. We're on an unsustainable fiscal path, and something's got to change. And the something is we're going to cut spending, and that could be cutting benefits to Medicare or Social Security recipients. We're going to have to raise taxes. Something's got to give, and I'm not sure what it is, and that's a political decision, but something's going to change.
Something that is unsustainable will not be
sustained. Be sustained. Exactly.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today and bringing us this rosy future. Hey, maybe you've taken an Uber instead of a cab or rented a house using an Airbnb. Those innovations are only the tip of the iceberg of what's possible in the sharing economy. Stick around to see how our next guest thinks these innovations will transform our lives.
This program is made possible in part by a grant from the Helen Jones Foundation, supporting education and the fine arts in keeping with the philosophy of Helen DeWitt Jones, who devoted her later life to sharing her wealth as a patron of philanthropic causes. The Helen Jones Foundation.
Founded in 2013, the Free Market Institute at Texas Tech University promotes the teaching and study of free market economics. As part of our programming, we sponsor a public lecture series open to students, faculty, staff, and the general public in the Lubbock community. Often, the speakers in that series are the guests that you see right here on Free to Exchange. More information is available at www.fmi.ttu.edu or by email at free.market@ttu.edu. Welcome back. Joining me now is Dr. Michael Munger. Dr. Munger is a professor of political science, economics, and public policy at Duke University. He's the author of more than 200 scholarly studies and 7 books, the latest of which, Tomorrow 3.0, he's here to talk about with us today. Mike, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here. Thanks.
So let me start by asking you something that might seem to some viewers kind of like a weird question. But why do we own stuff? And by that, I mean, we obviously need things, but why do we own stuff rather than borrowing or renting?
Well, it does seem like an odd question because it's something that we take for granted. So if I own an apple, I take a bite of the apple. You don't want it anymore. I eat the whole thing and it's gone. What's interesting is that we own things that are durable that I then have to store. And so that's a question that most of us haven't thought much about because we haven't had any alternative. And economics, one of the things that economics does is allow us to try to project into futures that don't yet exist. And so if I go to another city, I often fly around and go visit somewhere. If I fly to another city, it doesn't occur to me to buy a car. Instead, I rent a car. So there many things we're actually already used to renting. What we really need to do, and one of the theses of my new book is, we need to find better ways to share. Because we have so much stuff and we spend so much energy and money storing it. So the question is there a way that we can share it better than all of us owning our own one? And I think the answer is yes.
So that's what we're starting to see with technology. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit of how is technology changing in a way that allows us to share more?
Well, one of the reasons that we don't share is that we have a hard time finding someone to share it with. We have a hard time paying for it if there's some way that we need to pay for insurance or we need to share the expenses. And it's hard for us to trust each other. So those three components are something that I call together transactions cost. And so triangulation, or finding each other, transfer, actually making the payment and delivering the service, and trust. So you and I could share a lawnmower. Suppose we lived side by side and we wanted to, we both mow our lawns because we're both good citizens. We could share a lawnmower, but I might not be able to trust you. I might not be able to find a particular time when I would be able to use the lawnmower. Now that seems like a silly example, but there are real examples like Uber. So suppose that I have a car in a few minutes and you need a ride. It's going to be hard for us to find each other. It's going to be hard for us to make the payment, and I may not trust you and you may not trust me. But there's a new set of computer programs called apps that are available at app stores. Now, these aren't real stores. They don't really exist, but you can go online and you can buy these things. Apps are products. They're real products that entrepreneurs are making. That's what I think is different from has ever been before in history. You can now make apps that sell reductions in transactions cost and make money as an entrepreneur from doing it.
So these apps are just making it easier. And I want to just maybe elaborate on this a little bit. Of when we're using the word share and sharing economy, a lot of times people think, like when you were doing the lawnmower, like, oh, well, I'll just borrow it from you, you borrow it from me. This is a new type of market transaction. So This is still commerce going on in each of these. So the apps are coming up with ways to facilitate commerce where we couldn't before.
The key thing, and this is a hard thing to explain, partly because it's so simple that it escapes us. The thing about selling reductions in transactions cost is that you can make a commodity out of excess capacity. You can make a commodity out of excess capacity. So if I have something I only use half the time, normally I would store it the other time, but in principle, it's available for someone else's use. If I could find them, if we could make the payment, and if we could trust each other. So once you can commodify excess capacity, it changes everything.
So as I'm just thinking about this, give us some examples of ways that we have excess capacity that we're just not utilizing now that we might better be able to utilize.
Well, one of the most interesting ones is in Central Europe and in some countries in South America, there's an app called BlaBlaCar. Now, BlaBlaCar, it sounds like BLA car. Now, that sounds really silly, but suppose you go out to the interstate and, or even out to a country road, a bunch of cars and trucks passed you. You see that there's at least one seat in that car or truck that's empty. So it wouldn't cost them much more to haul one more person or some cargo, but it would be a lot of trouble for us to find each other. So,
well, usually we just, put out your thumb, right?
Well, if I ask people, when I'm talking about this, I ask people, how many of you hitchhike? Almost none of them hitchhike. And when you ask why, they give some variant of, well, the transactions cost are too. I know that's what they don't actually say that.
I'm sure they don't.
Well, they say, oh, it's creepy.
Yeah.
Or I'm not sure the person's going to the same place. Or it's, you have to wait a long time before somebody actually picks you up. BlaBlaCar is an app that sells 4 pieces of information. Where are you now? Where do you want to go? What time do you want to go? And how much do you want to talk to the other person? So if I'm in, say, the Czech Republic and I'm in Brno and I want to go to Prague, it's about 100 kilometers. I can get, and I want to go at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. I can pay just 10 euros and I can go from Brno to Prague. It would be $100 on the train and I wouldn't have as much frequency. The most interesting thing, I think, is the 4th piece of information. How much do you want to talk? Blah means I don't like other people very much. Blah, blah means enjoys a natter, likes to talk a little bit. Blah, blah, blah means that I talk so much that I rarely pause even for breath. Well, if you combine those 4 pieces of information, you have a truck that's going there anyway, but there's an empty seat. I can sell that in a way that doesn't cost me or you, the passenger, very much in terms of wasted time, search, or lack of trust. That once you start to think in those terms, bicycles, skis, luggage, all the stuff that you store in your garage could be an income-producing asset instead of a liability that you're paying to store.
And the technology produces the trust. How?
By outsourcing it. So if you ask an old person like me and they go to a city they don't know, how do you decide what restaurant to go to? I probably ask the concierge at the hotel. There's a decent chance he's sending me to his cousin's restaurant, though. Young people, they immediately know the answer. They look at Yelp. And Yelp is, so I say, well, who on Yelp do you trust? Well, I don't know any of those people. How can you trust them if you don't know them? You can outsource trust by using the independently registered opinions of many different people. So what you look at on Yelp is not the best reviews, because that might be the guy's mom or something fake. You look at the average and you look at the worst reviews. If you can find the average review and the worst review, you know something about that restaurant. You don't know any of those people, but you have outsourced trust. So that way of tokenizing reputation can work for all kinds of transactions. On eBay, on Amazon, you have the reputation of the seller. On Airbnb, you can actually say, can I trust this person not to come into this room I'm renting in the middle of the night? So reviews are a way of outsourcing trust and reducing the costs of making these transactions.
Right, and I think people are probably familiar with that from using Uber when you have to rate it after you take your ride. And that's a little bit different than the blah blah car, but it's accomplishing something similar, mobilizing not so much excess capacity, but underutilized cars and labor, right?
Well, if I have a car in a few minutes and I don't really need to use them, I can sell that at something like the marginal rather than the average cost. Now, economists use those terms. Let me explain them for a second. Marginal means I already have the car. I'm already paying the insurance. I'm already making the car payment. I would be willing to provide you a ride if you can pay me for the value of my time and the amount of gas and wear and tear on the car. So being able to sell things at what it costs me at the margin, rather than having to cover the full amount, the full average cost, is another way of thinking about commodifying excess capacity.
So in thinking about this, going from the specific to kind of the overall effect of you, there's a lot of valuable assets we're talking about. You mentioned Airbnb. This is houses that are excess capacity, whether it's BlaBlaCar or Uber, rides, labor. What do you think the broader implications of these type of things are for our overall economic future? It's called Tomorrow 3.0.
Well, the reason I call it Tomorrow 3.0 is that I think we're on the verge of the third great economic revolution. So the first was the Neolithic, the second was the industrial. Those were both very wrenching in the way that they destroyed institutions. So I think there's three answers to how is this going to affect society. The first is a lot of things that we own and store we will no longer need to, and that's going to change the way that we live. If you look at big cities, New York, Dallas, you look at all the parking, all the space that's wasted on parking and just storing cars means that they're not available for other uses. We have closets full of clothes that we rarely use. We have garages that are full of all sorts of things that we could rent instead. So the first is we can have a lot more space given the existing configuration. So we can live much more comfortably even given the existing configuration. Second is there's all sorts of things that we now pay for that we'll be able to rent. The total cost, both the transactions cost and the price of those, is going to fall a lot. The result is that we can live much more cheaply. We're going to need to, though, because of the third thing. And the third thing is that wages are going to fall. We have fetishized jobs. We have a 40-hour-a-week job. We have benefits that are associated with that. I think that's largely going to disappear. If jobs disappear, it means that wages and our ability to earn money is going to fall. And so the question is, and it's a race, are wages going to fall more or are prices going to fall more? That's going to determine the sort of level of welfare that we have.
So I'd also suspect that it's not going to be equal in how that plays out. And we already see it, right? I mean, we've seen, you used to live in Austin working at another university that will remain nameless.
Another school in the UT system.
Yeah. But there they had the city council essentially banned Uber and Lyft for a while. It's since been reinstated because of a state law. But clearly taxi cab drivers don't like Uber, and we see protests around the world on this.
You saw buggy whip manufacturers and people who made carts objecting to cars. And in fact, in my book, I talk about some of the regulations that carriage and horse users and sellers tried to impose on cars. You had to walk. You had to walk in front of a car with a red flag. And if you saw a upcoming horse, you had to hide the car. Now, that only lasted for about a decade. So I think what's going to happen with many of these changes is that people who now make living from selling things in a certain way are going to lose their livelihoods. So you're right. The impact in many ways is beneficial for some consumers, particularly those who have a source of income. Many people are going to lose their source of income. And the question is socially, how are we going to handle the problems that are created by having dramatically increasing inequality? And not only that, but a sense of uncertainty about how it is that the institutions of society I can rely on to plan, to come up with a life plan. Where am I going to work? How am I going to earn money? How am I going to provide for my family?
Yet more change on the horizon. I look forward to tomorrow 3.0 and seeing how this all plays out. Thank you for joining us today.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Well, on today's show, we talked about the future and reasons for both optimism and pessimism. We learned about how reductions in transactions costs through the new sharing economy mobilizes capital that otherwise sits idle. I think there's great potential for future economic growth coming from innovations in that direction. But at the same time, we learned about the thoroughly unsustainable path our federal government is on in its spending in its promised spending, I should say, in Social Security, Medicare, and for that matter, the regular federal debt. That can just simply not be sustained in the long run. Now, perhaps if the innovations from the sharing economy or other areas in our economy create more and more economic growth, that can push that day of reckoning farther and farther down the line so that we can afford it for longer. But at least for me personally, I'm not counting on that for my retirement. We'll see you next time.